everybody, a wonderful, warm welcome to the next edition of Business for Humanity, Reinventing Capitalism. And we are very excited to continue our discussion about different heterodox and traditional economic paradigms to understand what we can collectively do to make capitalism and the economy and our businesses a tiny little bit better. Before we start, as always, we would love to hear from you. Who are you? What brings you to the session? Please join our traditional 4-word check-in. So if you want to put 4 words onto the chat, where are you coming from? What's your main role, or what's the role you want to take on this call? And is there anything you're willing to share in terms of what you have personally done to make your or business in general better in the last 2 or 3 months? And whilst we're doing that, I will spend 1 word on the rules of the game for this call. We are trying to create something that is educational, and I want to warmly welcome a number of classes, students that are joining the call. So hello to all the students who are listening and watching us on big screens, I'm being told. Thank you very much for joining. So it should be educational. We should be collectively friendly but critical, oriented towards action, hopefully inspirational, and I'm coming to Alex, almost credible. Credibility and evidence-based is a big thing for us on this call, which leads me immediately to introducing our guests. And I'm very proud and honored to have with us Alex Edmans. And Alex Edmans, as you can see it on the slide, is an academic star. He has had a fantastic career, coming originally from MIT and then investment banking, but making his career as a professor, first at Wharton and now at London Business School, professor of finance. He's been very successful in his publishing, not only his book, which we are going to discuss today, his recent book, which came out 2 or 3 weeks ago, and which we are, of course, inviting everybody to have a look at, but also his many academic essays that he's published. And you can see a lot of the awards and TED Talks on the slide. But Alex, what makes me personally proud to have you on this call is almost something else. You're bringing professional attitude, you're striving for excellence, you're seeking for truth, and you're one of the very few academics who I have spoken to over the many years who is truly engaged with students in trying to help them to understand, dialogue, educate on social media and everywhere. And I think that is truly exemplary. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you. It's a huge privilege to be here. Thank you to you, Otti, for the invitation, but also to everybody for giving up an hour or more to listen to me in your busy day at work.
Thank you very much indeed. And with that, I come first to the sharing of the resources that we have prepared for everybody on the website. So please have a look at that. Not only will you find all the links to many of Alex's essays and his websites, you will also find summaries of the book that we're discussing today and our personal kind of extrapolation of the topics that we want to talk about on this call. But with that, let me also introduce my friends and colleagues on this call. As always, the researcher, Antoinette Weibel from the University of St. Gallen. Hello, Antoinette. As always, the activist, Kees Klomp from the University in the Netherlands. Kees, thank you so much for being here. And we're very proud of Kees, by the way, as well, who just got a big award for his children's books in the Netherlands. So please have a look at the new things that Kees is producing as well. The business guy, that's myself, and the voice of the future, Silvio, who's going to ask the first question to Alex later about how the relevance of all of this plays into the role of the future leaders. And of course, the valiant explorers, everybody else on this call, who hopefully is checking in the meantime on the chat. This what we're going to do in the next 1.5 hours, and Alex is going to stay with us for the first hour. We're going to talk through the paradigm of Pieconomics. Alex is going to present about half an hour, and then we're going to have an exploratory Q&A, and everybody's invited to provide their questions. We then might go into a brainstorming break, or we go directly into the meta inquiry, where we will discuss and compare Alex's approach with what we heard from Kees in the first session, but also from Christian Felber in the last one. Before we start, as always, one quick warm-up for the audience, which is about a relevant knowledge item that we will find useful in the conversation today. What is corporate governance? So everybody on the chat, could you give us your views when we talk about corporate governance? What is this about? The characteristics or the focus areas or the bodies that are involved in corporate governance? Vital yet often boring. Holding the space for the shared values. Okay, interesting. Fairness, Karen. Very good. I'll hand over to Antoinette for the answer, and then we're going to start.
Yeah, and I have to say, 1999 was my last seminar when I was taught corporate governance, so I had to look it up. It's a system by which a company is directed and controlled, and two institutions are of particular importance. So we have the board of directors who hold management accountable, define strategic objectives, assess risks, suggest compensation, and oversee transparent reporting. And on the other side, of course, management who has to execute against the defined objectives. In practice today, the board is serving mainly the shareholders and seeks to maximize shareholder value, but we have to say that this is not demanded in many jurisdictions. And finally, most corporate governance codes tend to stress the principle of fairness, accountability, responsibility, and transparency. Whether that's always true, that's up to you.
That was a very short and a very somewhat cynical summary, Antoinette. Thank you very much indeed. So corporate governance, everybody, is something that we will certainly pick up in the discussion with Alex. With that, over to Kees to introduce Pieconomics.
Yes, well, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Alex. And I would like to do that based upon a book that got published in 2014. So a couple of years before Alex's really important book was the book by an American writer and researcher, Aaron Hurst, wherein he introduced the purpose economy. And this was actually the first book wherein purpose as a driving force in new economics got noticed and acknowledged, and it created a lot of innovation in business and also in the field of corporate social responsibility and sustainability. But until Professor Alex Edmans' book, most of it was quite shallow and superficial, and Alex really took the subject of purpose to what I think is another academic level, wherein he backed purpose up with serious, substantial scientific research. So having said that, it is my pleasure and also a bit of an honor to introduce Alex. So the floor is yours. And for everybody, if you have any questions to Alex during his talk, please put them down in the chat so we can share the questions afterwards directly with Alex. Alex, the floor is yours.
Okay. Obviously, this is part of the Rethinking Capitalism initiative. You've heard a lot of great perspectives over this series. Let me present my perspective, which will hopefully be both complementary, but also additive to the various perspectives that you've heard from the other contributors. And what I'm typically going to focus on is the business case for purpose. So absolutely, purpose is good for wider society. It's good for the environment. But at the end of the day, companies need to make money. And I'm a professor of finance, not philosophy and business ethics. I'm an ex-investment banker at Morgan Stanley. But the reason why I can be so passionate about purpose is not only for its social and environmental impact, but also for its financial impact. But how can that be? Because we often hear about purpose being for wider society at the expense of shareholders. This is because I might have a quite different view as to what it means for a company to be purposeful. And let me just illustrate this different view right now with an example. So let's go back to 2003. So over 20 years ago. And why I go so far back is really purpose was not a thing back then. So nowadays there's social, there's media, there's customer pressure to be purposeful. But back then, companies didn't need to do it. But some companies voluntarily chose to do this. And one company was Vodafone, the UK telecoms firm. And they noticed that in Kenya, citizens were using their phone to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. So maybe their plan allowed them 200 minutes per month. If they had 50 minutes left over, they would transfer them to their friend in return for a few sacks of grain. So this gave Vodafone an idea. What if they could develop a technology that will allow them to transfer not mobile minutes, but actual cash. At the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. They had to rely on cash, which could be forged, it could be lost, it could be stolen. So if Vodafone could pull this off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, they launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya, which allows people to transfer money from phone to phone just as easily as you could transfer a text message. So the social impact of this was huge. Within the first 7 years, this lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. And many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality as well. But the nice finale to this story is that Vodafone was able to turn this into a profit. So even though this was motivated by the desire to contribute towards society, to solve this problem of financial inclusion in Kenya, ultimately they were able to monetize it by charging a small percentage of every transaction as a fee. And so a decision taken primarily to benefit wider society ultimately benefited shareholders. So why am I starting my talk with this example? It's to ask two questions. So the first is, how much value did M-Pesa create for society? And the second is, if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa, what would have been the public outrage or damage to Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody. We're going to have enough chance for interaction later. And the reason for not polling people is most people I speak to agree with the answer. How much value did M-Pesa create for society? A huge amount. It lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. It contributed to gender equality. But if I turn to the second question, what would have been the public outrage if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa? Nothing. Right? There would have been no media backlash. There would have been no customer boycott, because people would have never thought it was even possible to come up with this innovation of mobile money. So this is the different view about purpose that I'm going to speak to in my introduction. So we often think that purpose is the answer to the second question. A purposeful business is one that does no harm. It doesn't cheat on taxes. It doesn't pollute the environment. It doesn't mistreat its workers. And absolutely, companies should do no harm. But you already knew this before coming on to my talk today. Instead, I want to shift our thinking and to say purpose is much more about answering the first question, actively doing good, actively serving wider society. So why is that? Well, partially, there's a moral and ethical case. We don't just want to avoid contributing towards problems. As a large company, we should try to solve them. But as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the moral, on the business and financial case. And the business and financial case of the second question is, we do purpose just about risk management. Make sure we do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal, be this Volkswagen or Rio Tinto or Wells Fargo. But if you view purpose as only being about risk management, you do the minimum possible. You don't go above and beyond, because anything more than that minimum is just wasting money that could otherwise be distributed as dividends to shareholders. But if you view purpose as the answer to that first question, it's about actively creating value, then if you actively create value for wider society, even if you were not forced to do it, ultimately some of that value can come back to investors in the form of profits. And so that is the idea behind the difficult to pronounce Pieconomics, but just as a reminder, it's economics, Pieconomics. So what is the idea of Pieconomics? Well, you think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And that pie can be split between investors in the form of profits and society in the form of fair taxes, fair wages, and fair prices. And often we think that purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. So let's give up some profits to give it to a wider society that's fair and equal. That was some of your definitions about what good governance is. But the problem with that is that ultimately this reduces profits. And this is bad for shareholders. And notice shareholders are not nameless, faceless capitalists. They could be pension funds investing for retirement. They might be insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business needs to take investors seriously. So this is why my view of purpose is that it's about growing the pie. So we absolutely do want to increase the orange. We do want to serve society, but the way we do this is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with some of these crazy and bold ideas like launching mobile money. Because the beauty of this is, even though this is motivated by the desire to increase the orange to serve society, ultimately by creating value, society will pay you for the value that you create, and ultimately a decision taken to serve society ultimately manifests in profits. Now, what I'd encourage you to do is throughout my talk to be skeptical. And I really appreciate how Otti introduced me, is that even though I'm somebody who wants to talk about purpose and I'm a strong advocate about it, we want to look at these things through a critical lens. Why? Not because we're being cynical, but because if we want to put this into practice and implement it, we need to understand both the strengths and the weaknesses to make sure that we practice it in a way that maximizes the former and addresses the latter. So is this really about purpose? Well, I've spoken about growing the pie, creating value for wider society. But you might think, shouldn't any company do that? You don't need a purpose to want to create value. For example, if you're a car company, would you invest in electric cars? Well, the answer is yes. Even if I don't care about climate change, I could run a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet will tell me there are benefits to investing in electric cars from a pure profitability standpoint. Yes, for the first few years, the cash flows will be negative, but in the long term, they will be positive. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, I can use my spreadsheet and I will show that the net present value is positive. And we know that the real world is uncertain, but we can do a sensitivity analysis. We can look at an upside case for selling electric cars, a downside case, let's say if the government phases out subsidies, and if even the downside case is good enough, we're going to go ahead. But what I'm trying to highlight is that there are certain decisions that it's very difficult to justify with a spreadsheet calculation, no matter how sophisticated and how complex your spreadsheet is. So if I go back to Vodafone launching M-Pesa, the net present value would have probably been hugely negative. Nobody had ever pulled off this idea of launching mobile money before. And let's say they succeeded. Well, it might have a big reputational risk. What if people started using it for money laundering, which is the big concern with cryptocurrency right now? And let's say you were able to stop that. Well, then how would you be able to monetize this? You were serving some of the poorest people in the world. Indeed, Vodafone at the time had a strong business strategy that was to expand in the West and win mobile phone auctions in the UK because that was where there was money to be made. So this is something that would have been quite difficult to justify with a net present value calculation. So this is where purpose came in. And Vodafone's purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socioeconomic progress. And by investing in this, this was what led to them making a decision that they might not be able to justify with spreadsheets. So simply put, in a world in which all your competitors, all other companies out there know to do spreadsheet analysis, how will you as a company differentiate yourself from your peers? It's by taking decisions that other companies might not take. And in a world in which everybody is comfortable with financial analysis, can purpose drive you? Can it inspire you? Can it spur you to making an investment that might not be justified entirely with a financial calculation? So at this point in my talk, you might think, well, everything I say, that sounds great. That sounds even maybe inspiring. But is it wishful thinking? Right, where is the evidence? I seem to be suggesting that if companies do good for the world, then magically they'll be better off because of some good karma. But that sounds almost too good to be true. And so I've given you one example of Vodafone, but how do you know that that was not one hand-picked example? Maybe I looked at tons of companies and Vodafone was the one case that paid off. And that's why I'm making a big thing about it. It supports my view. So this is why my day job as a business school professor is not to tell stories. It's not even to write case studies, but to look at rigorous evidence across hundreds of companies over dozens of industries. And when you look at evidence, we need to be careful of confirmation bias. So this is the idea that people will accept evidence uncritically if it confirms what they would like to be true. And that's a particular problem with purposeful business because everybody wants to think that purpose pays off. And so this was the subject of a TED talk I gave a few years ago, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, about how careful we will need to be about evidence about something we feel strongly about, because there's the big danger that we accept something just because we want it to be true. That's also the main theme of my very recent book, which came out a few weeks ago, called May Contain Lies. And to give you an example of this, let's have a study by the UK regulator, which you would think you could trust because this is the regulator, on a topic, gender diversity, which all of us here, I'm sure, really care about and want to be true. And they released a report claiming that more diverse companies have better financial performance. This was tweeted and shared and reposted hundreds of times. But the actual test they had in the back of their document ran 90 different regressions and 0 were significant. So they basically lied about the results in the executive summary. But because people wanted this to be true, they shared it, shouted it from the rooftops without checking. So clearly, if I'm going to talk to you about something here on this call, I need to make sure it's backed up by evidence, not by just nice statements. And so this is something that I wanted to look at myself, and I did this about 18 years ago when I was a PhD student at MIT. So I never set out to be a professor of purpose. I just cared about creating long-term value. And how I got into purpose was the evidence suggesting that this is something that's financially beneficial. So what did I do? Well, I had to think about, how do you measure whether a company is purposeful? You might think you can look at a company's purpose statement, but you can say some nice things and not deliver. So you might think, well, do you put your money where your mouth is? How much do you spend on CSR? But that's not good, because you might spend a lot, but you might give to the wrong charities. So I wanted to look at the output, not how much money you spend, but how much value that you create. And so what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So these are companies that go above and beyond in how they treat their peers, going back to my first section where I talked about purpose as actively doing good, not just doing no harm. But why do I look at employees as my measure of purpose? Why don't I look at the environment? Because climate change is really important. Well, climate change is important, but climate change matters more for some sectors like energy and transport, and not so much others such as tech. But employees, they matter in virtually every company. So what I found was the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% compounded. So simply put, the companies that treated their employees well, they weren't just being moral and ethical or being charitable, giving them part of the pie. They're being commercially sensible, growing the pie, and ultimately shareholders were better. Now again, I ask you to be skeptical, because this is a correlation, and I have suggested employee satisfaction leads to better financial performance. But how do we know it's not the opposite? Maybe once the company is already performing well, then it can invest in employees. Or maybe there are common factors that affect both. If you're in the tech industry, your employees are happy because it's a more fun job than coal mining. And also, the tech industry has performed better than the coal mining industry. So I have to do a lot of work to rebut those alternate explanations. I'll refer you to the book for how I do this so that I can go quickly into my final section. What do we do about this? So how do we put this into practice as a business leader? So first, let me drill down on what it means to be purposeful. So some companies have a purpose statement which looks like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. So purpose seems like altruism. Let's tick as many boxes as possible. But that is not what the word purpose means. So let's go back to the English language. What does purpose mean outside of a business context? It means being focused and targeted. So if I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. So I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And while that might seem a bit lofty and idealistic, why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play all have to be specific. Your purpose cannot be to solve all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Those are goals for countries, not for companies like yours. Maybe your goal is to focus on the 3 or 4 where you can really move the needle. So how do you decide the 3 or 4 things to focus on? So if you remember only one thing from my talk, let it be this question. Ask yourself, what is in my hand? So by this, I mean, what are the resources? What is the expertise that my company has? And how can I use these resources and this expertise to serve society if I think a little bit more creatively? For example, for Vodafone, what they had in their hand was telecoms expertise, which they used to send text messages. And they repurposed that in order to produce mobile money. Now, notice that is a quite different approach to how other companies think about purpose. Rather than looking internally at what is in their hand, what are they good at, they look externally at what is in the media because they want to be seen to be relevant. For example, when George Floyd was murdered, many companies gave millions to Black Lives Matter. Now, clearly, I'm somebody who cares about racial equality, but if your company, is your expertise really to know that Black Lives Matter is a better charity than Doctors Without Borders or the American Cancer Society? If not, you should not be devoting your resources to things where you don't have expertise. And so this means in practice doing 3 things, and these things are what I'm going to end it with. The first is doing new things, generating new business. Now, of course, any company wants to generate new business, even if your only goal was money. But a purposeful company uses purpose to drive them to generate new business that they might not have thought of otherwise had they just focused on profits. So I've given you an example of new products and services like M-Pesa, but also you can think about this, new clients. So until recently, the CEO of NatWest was Alison Rose, and before she became CEO, she did the Rose Review, which found that £250 billion of value could be added to the UK economy if women had the same access to financing as men. So why might they not have the same access? Well, as a startup, you don't have a long list of 10 years of financial statements that a bank can base a lending decision on. So often they base it on the confidence of the entrepreneur in a meeting. And there's evidence suggesting that men do better in those interviews than women. But it's not just a male-female thing. Ethnic minorities might do worse. In the UK, there's lots of regional inequality. If you have just a different accent, then people might think differently of you. And so she thought, well, if I can provide financing to customers, entrepreneurs that my competitors are turning down, then I will not only be serving wider society, it's not only good for society, but it's good for me as a company because I'm going to find customers that are the people incorrectly turned down. Okay, so what else can purpose involve? Doing exactly the same thing in different ways. So why I stress this is like examples like Vodafone are really inspiring, but they're also unrealistic because an innovation like Vodafone, which was a huge thing, you might only come up with this once every 5 years. So if purpose only applies once every 5 years, then how does it affect the day-to-day? But what I'm trying to highlight here is just doing your core activity in an excellent way can have a huge impact on society. So when people think about purpose, one of the things they get wrong is they think purpose needs to mean that we're doing something distinctly purposeful, like employee volunteering or something like that. But if your core job is being a bank, just by being excellent at customer service, being excellent about allocation of capital, that creates a lot of value. One example of process innovation, do the same thing in a different way, is the pharmaceuticals industry. So for many years, decades even, it was taken for granted you need to do animal testing. But there were pharmaceuticals companies who said, well, let's change this. Why? We care about wider society. We want to avoid pain and suffering on these animals, but also distress on the scientists who have to test on these animals and then see these animals get destroyed on a daily basis. So this inspired people to do things such as chemical testing and testing with computer simulations. That is good for wider society. It minimizes pain and suffering, but it's also good for money. Rhesus monkeys can cost up to $50,000. And so this is a way of, an innovation taken which was prompted by purpose, ultimately leading to cost savings. This leads to the final part, which is let's do the same thing in exactly the same way, but recognize the purpose of what we're doing. So some of you will know this picture. 3 people are doing a job. One says, I'm laying bricks. The other says, I'm making a living. The third says, I'm building a cathedral. So they're all doing the same thing, but only the third person recognizes the ultimate purpose. So let me end with another story from Dame Alison Rose. So when the pandemic was over, and she was able to go to restaurants again, she took her senior management team out to a restaurant in Covent Garden, London, called the Darjeeling Express. And she had the owner of the restaurant, Asma Khan, give a talk. And Asma said, when I came to the UK 30 years ago, nobody believed in me. I'm a woman. I'm an immigrant. People don't give loans to immigrant women. They view business leaders as like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. But you, NatWest, you gave a loan to me. I've opened this restaurant. I've served this many thousand customers, and I've given this many employees jobs. And so this was really powerful because let's say you were the loan officer at NatWest who worked on that loan application. Maybe you get 10 loan applications in every day. You accept 3, you reject 7. You don't think much more of it. But if you're somebody who, when you realize the ultimate purpose of what we do here is we allow people to ultimately start businesses, serve customers, and give jobs, then this ultimate purpose, which we as senior leaders see, but sometimes as junior employees they don't, what is the extent to which we can convey the purpose of our company and just convey to how much to our employees, how much they're making a difference. Okay, so let me stop here. But the reason why I wrote this book was I think for far too long, people have thought about purpose as being just nice for wider society, moral and ethical, but often finance people have been skeptical, saying this is at the expense of wider society. So I wanted to highlight how in many cases, actually what is good for wider society can be good business in the long term. This is not based on wishful thinking or a couple of picked anecdotes, but something which large-scale evidence suggests that certain aspects of purpose do indeed pay off in the long term. Thank you so much again, Otti and Kees, for the invitation. So let me just hand back for the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Short applause. This is symbolic for each and every one of us for your crash course on Pieconomics. Fascinating. Otti, I'm giving the hand back to you because we are on a tight schedule.
Wonderful. And hopefully the slides are again visible. Thank you very much, both Kees and Alex. Super exciting. And as Kees said, because Alex is going to stay here until the end of the hour, I'm immediately handing over for our exploratory Q&A, which Antoinette is going to lead. Antoinette, over to you.
Wonderful. I'm just very quickly showing you again the inquiry framework. So we're going to dip into the core values underpinning this alternative economic model. Then we try to look at the solution space and how it fits to these values. And then we are going to ask about transformation. Who is going to change what and why? If we go a slide further, then you'll see that we want to explore the underlying values to get a better grasp of growing the value pie, and then go into the institutions, as I already said. But in that case, it's going to be very much on the reform task of investors and the finance industry, which we found particularly interesting. and then want to understand how this all important mind shift is coming all about. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a map on the journey. But we start, as usual, with our young leader, who is asking the first question here.
Thank you, Antoinette, and hello to everybody. My first question to Alex would be, how can Pieconomics principles practically inform decisions of business students, for example, or other students about where to work and which companies to support?
Yes, I think it would be a company where you feel is actually truly purposeful. It creates value for wider society. And why is this important? I think, well, you have one life, and this is what you're going to do with your life, is to work for a company where you think it actually makes a difference, where your work makes a difference. It's not just a job. It's not just something that pays your salary. Obviously, those things are important. I don't want to be too idealistic. You do want the company to provide all of those, but this is often not enough. And this is why sometimes there's the concerns about quiet quitting. And nowadays, maybe people are working from home. And so if you're not really engaged in what you're doing, you're not going to be performing at your best. So let me give an example. So my first job was Morgan Stanley investment banking. And so you might think, well, this company is not purposeful because aren't investment bankers about making as much money? So there was a time where our client was Abbey National, and they were asking us to give a pitch for why Abbey National should hire Morgan Stanley to sell Porterbrook, their train leasing company. So my boss was a third-year executive director. And so he was up for managing director promotion. So if there was ever a time to be short-termist, it was then. But he said to Abbey National, don't hire Morgan Stanley. Actually, don't hire anybody. We don't think now is the right time for you to sell Porterbrook because you won't get that good a price. And so this was hugely risky. So there was the chance that Abbey National would have gone with somebody else. If you don't want to work for us, there's loads of other banks who'd be happy to get our multi-million-dollar fee. And then he would have been in trouble and maybe missed out on managing director promotion because there's a huge committee that each time you miss business, they look at why you missed business. But Abbey National took his advice. And so this was great that I was working for somebody who was so ethical. His goal was to be a trusted advisor. And then a few years later, when Santander made the takeover bid for Abbey National, Abbey National gave Morgan Stanley the entire defense mandate because they realized how trustworthy this company was. And my boss is a guy called William Chalmers, who's now chief financial officer of Lloyds, one of the largest UK banks. And clearly I'm slightly biased, but I think it's good that you have one of the leading banks with such a senior executive being somebody with a strong moral compass.
Wonderful. And I think now Otti is very eager to start asking you the value questions.
Well, I think, Alex, as you can imagine, my challenge is going to come from the ethical perspective. But I think you set out to do two things, as you pointed out. So one is to talk to the finance industry and investors. I think the second point, which comes through in the introduction of your book, is actually you want to do something against the distrust that people have in capitalism. Or as you say, there's a lot of noise on people doubting that the system can work for them. I think you're doing a good job personally speaking to the finance industry. I'm still, as Matthias pointing out, I'm wondering, does all your proof actually add up to suggesting that purposeful companies are also ethical? And here, I've got two challenges. The first is, in your work, you're saying you're using evidence, but the CSP-CFP relationship that you highlight is not necessarily proving any ethical relationship. And secondly, on the upside, so the companies that truly produce social value, you are actually using a lot of case studies. I counted, you're quoting Merck 72 times in your book as an example of a company that is acting purposefully. That is not directly related to any of the regression analysis, so to speak, that you choose. And even worse, I would suggest, you're using the example of game theory at some point, suggesting that people in the ultimatum game should be happy with just 1 penny if they get a very, very low distribution of the pie. And that wouldn't stand up any ethical scrutiny, not even Benthamite utilitarianism. So isn't there a risk that you're bringing an ethical question about whether companies act morally back to a question about financial optimization.
So I don't agree with that. So I don't see how you would actually prove that companies anything about ethical behavior, because it's not clear how you define ethical behavior. So what is ethical behavior? So is it ethical for me as a company to hire the best people to my company? Or do I have some moral obligation to hire Chinese people or women or people who've never gone to university? So different people might have different views as to what ethical behavior is. So what I try to do in my studies, and it's not just my studies, but studies which other people do, is they will have their particular measure. They won't call it ethical or not. They'll just say it's a measure. Employee satisfaction, is that ethical or is that good business? They might have another measure, customer satisfaction, is that ethical, is that good business? So what I'm able to do is to link their measures, or which are linked to purpose, to some performance measure. But why I look at financial performance is not because I believe financial performance is better than ethics, but it's something which can be measured, whereas with ethical behavior, who says what is ethical? Also, number two, because what I look at is long-term financial performance. In the long term, most, not all, and I highlight there's trade-offs in chapter 3, but many things that we do to help wider society show up in the long-term stock price. Now, in the game theory, I absolutely do not say that this is what people should do. I say, actually, people might still think that the best way to play in the ultimatum game is to try to just reject any split, because what they care about is more sabotaging somebody else rather than benefiting themselves. So it may well be that people are quite free to say, I don't care that a company is having a lot of value for wider society and making me money. I'm just jealous of the CEO getting so much money that I want this company not to exist. That's perfectly fair. You can have those preferences. Again, I don't see this being an ethical standpoint, because I'm not making a stance as to what your preferences should be. I don't think anybody can make that stance. All I'm saying is, given a set of objectives, we can use evidence to find the way to achieve those objectives, but we need to recognize that different people will have different objectives.
Okay, so I take that up. So Paul was asking, does it matter whether you contribute to social value from intrinsic reasons or just to make more profit in the long run? Or very shortly, do intentions matter?
Well, I think intentions do matter, because I think without intentions, you will not have the same outcome. So if your outcome is just to do things to make money, there are certain actions that you would be foregoing, because if you cannot see the ultimate link to financial performance, then it may well be that you're not going to have that outcome. So I know there are people who argue it's only outcomes that matter without intentions. It doesn't matter what the intentions are. And I can understand that on a theoretical perspective, is we just care about the outcomes. But from a practical perspective, I don't think you can divorce one from the other, because while there are some outcomes which you could have even with the most financial intentions, like the electric car company, there are other outcomes where, unless you had a purpose, you might not have engaged in the behavior that would have delivered that outcome.
Okay, I would suggest that we are now going to the institutions. And here I'm just personally very interested. I have the feeling that you are quite critical towards regulations.
The entire chapter 10 explains why regulation is absolutely important. So it highlights that at the whole heart of this problem is a market failure. A market failure means that in the long term, there are certain actions that a company can have to affect society, where even in the long term, they do not suffer the consequences. So this is one of the big challenges to my Pieconomics framework, is Pieconomics does not always work, because sometimes in the long term, there can be actions that you take to affect society that you are not bearing the consequences of. So if I'm in an insecticide company and I put neonicotinoids into my insecticides, in the absence of regulation here, I'm not suffering. It might be the food companies that rely on bees for pollination that are suffering here. Similarly, with climate change, I can pollute a lot, and it could be a real estate company with waterfront properties who is suffering in the absence of a global carbon tax. So I think regulation is important if regulation is correctly directed So where the evidence comes in is the evidence suggests that regulation should try to highlight the underlying causes of the problems, not the symptoms of the problems. But if you are indeed regulating the entire underlying causes, such as market failures and externalities, and then on the flip side, subsidizing things with positive externalities, there absolutely is a role for regulation. And this is what chapter 10 of the book is about.
Yeah,
but if I can build on that, I think what Antoinette meant, Alex, was if we compare your framework, for example, with Colin Meyer, who we interviewed last week, who is insisting that the externalities, to the degree possible, have to be embedded in the concept of profit. You're actually defining social value as profit plus externalities. So in that regard, he's advocating for a change in the accounting system as well as the legal surround in order to force people and make stakeholders accountable for the purposefulness, but based on a new concept of profit. So how are you accommodating the fact that externalities in your framework actually, to a degree, voluntarily addressed and not necessarily showing up in the profit definition as such?
They won't be voluntarily addressed. This is why we have regulation. Regulation is to force companies to take them into account, because otherwise there's certain things. The problem with an externality is it's not out of the goodness of the heart that a company is going to take this into account. Because the definition of externality is something where in the long term, the company is not suffering. And so this is the role of regulation here. This is in contrast to Colin Mayer's arguments, which are not supported by any legal setting. So he is a great finance professor, but he makes very strong legal statements here. How can you regulate and force a company to be purposeful? What does it mean for a company to be purposeful? As somebody, I think Paul highlighted earlier, whose ethics? How do you define what is purposeful? Is it purposeful for a company to close down a coal-fired power station? Okay, that's good for the environment, but it is something where it's going to be bad for workers, and it might be bad for energy security. There's a great legal paper by two actual legal scholars, Jill Fish and Stephen Davidoff-Solomon, called The Value of a Public Benefit Corporation, saying that we have public benefit corporations which claim that companies need to have a stated public benefit to care about wider society, but legally this is close to unimplementable. So I don't see how you can have this by putting it into the Articles of Association, but instead what you can do as the government is highlight specific externalities that you think are making a problem to wider society. We can tax them if they're moderately bad. If they're extremely bad, we can ban them outright, such as dumping waste into a river. But this is a role, I think, in which regulation plays an important role, and this is why I believe that regulation should address these market failures.
Okay, maybe a last one in the institutions, and this is one which is more about distributive justice. You clearly show that large pay differentials are good for the company's profit, so it's not what everybody says in the popular press that we should cut it down. So the pay dispersion is not a problem, but it might still be a case of, if you look from a justice point of view, that you say, well, but it's the role which is kind of making that person able to scale it. It's not the person's merit himself. So that's a justice question.
Okay, so if we have a race in the Olympic Games, who should get the gold medal?
Guy who deserves it.
So how do you call it deserve? So is it the fastest person, or is the person who trained hardest? So let's say somebody had a more difficult running background and finishes fourth. Should he get the gold medal?
Well, that was one of the big discussions, as I can remember it, but I was just trying to find out what your definition, or whether it plays a role at all. What
different? So if you're asking about justice, what is justice? Is justice in terms of output? Is justice in terms of is justice in terms of effort? Is justice in terms of relative to some particular starting point? So I can't answer your question until you define to me what you believe just is, because
I think, Alex, the point was the word justice doesn't occur very often in the book. So the question is, if we're going from the micro to the macro level, is there any consideration for any notion of distributive justice on whatever, be it of access or of outcomes or whatever? But how do you combine your view on the decision making that you described very detailed inside the company with a macro view on justice that is distributive across the entire economy? That's, I think, the question.
Yeah, and that is fully answered in the book. The way that you get to distributive justice, and my view of justice is that justice is based on your contribution. So if you contribute, then it is fair to be rewarded for your contribution. However, there are other aspects to justice, and they're what you might call, but have not clearly defined, distributive justice. That can be addressed by governance through high income tax. So this is why I explicitly say we should have higher income tax, even higher than we have at the moment for wealthy people. But what I'm saying here is that that should apply to wealthy people who get their wealth from all professions. So at the moment, there's a concern about CEO pay of CEOs who earn a lot. But why is it CEOs who earn a lot? So management consultants who earn a lot, and lawyers who earn a lot, and hedge fund managers who earn a lot, even authors who earn a lot, or musicians that earn a lot. So we might have a view that it doesn't matter how much you contribute. We have this idea, then this might be behind the universal basic income idea, that as humanity, everybody should be entitled to a certain standard of living. And in order to have that standard of living, it needs to be that people who are wealthier pay more. So this is something which is, again, part of a moral case as to what your notions of justice is. I do talk about it in the book, but I don't talk much about it because this is not my focus. My focus is on how companies create long-term value for wider society. We can have a philosophical discussion as how much people should be entitled to. Should everybody be entitled to have, say, enough income to buy them 4 holidays a year or 1 holiday a year? That is a question which is going to be affecting how the government should be redistributing income. But again, that's a government redistribution aspect, which is quite different from my focus, which is how can companies create long-term value.
I think it's a great discussion. I think there's more to it also in terms of the distribution of rights within the context of the corporate governance, as well as the distribution of rights and obligations inside the company that would also be taken up by this. But I think it's a long and complicated question. I think your point is the redistribution is done by the government through taxation or through social welfare. And I think that's exactly what you say in the book. So
that's correct. And that should be redistribution of wealthy people who get their wealth in different ways. So it's not just, so often we focus on the redistributive justice issue, but we focus too narrowly on CEOs when there's wealthy people who get their wealth in many, many fields. And if our concern here is really about social justice rather than envy of a particular CEO, then this is a systematic issue, and that systematic issue should be addressed by systematic ways such as taxes, rather than just focusing on some people who happen to be in the public eye because they're CEOs of firms.
I agree.
Okay, so Kees, you want to take up the change section?
Yes. This webcast series is about reinventing capitalism, which, of course, is focusing on the potential of system change. So I would like to go into that direction. The growing the pie approach is very clearly works on, let's say, an individual company level. You made a really, really solid case for that in your book. But I was wondering, have you imagined or worked out strategies how this might work on a system level?
What this means is that if each company thinks about how they can create value for wider society, then at a system basis, this will be really positive. And notice here, when I talk about growing the pie, I don't mean growing the firm. So there's people who say, okay, we don't want growth, we want degrowth because growth is bad. But that is focused on a narrow version of growth, which is GDP growth. So when I think about growth, growing the pie, I'm talking about not growing financial capital, but human capital, social capital, natural capital. So how will I grow human capital? By providing my employees with a healthy, enriching place to work, by providing with mentorship and skills development, taking them to meetings. How can I grow natural capital? By finding more efficient ways to produce. And I think if companies do this, and the fault is not of the degrowth people, but often of the growth people. The growth people often have a too narrow view as to what growth is. If you think about growing the pie for wider society, not just the blue part, which is profits, and that's something where individual companies, if that adds up, then this will have a big system-wide approach.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Wonderful. And I think, Alex, with that, we are at the hour, on the hour. What a great conversation. As you said, critical, but only started, sadly, but to be continued, I'm sure. So with that, again, thank you so much for having made the time. Thank you for the great critical discussion, and hopefully see you again on social media very soon.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks so much for challenging me. Bye.
All right. I think with that, it's almost a superb starting point for our meta inquiry section, which I'm going to bring up now, because all these discussions that we just started with Alex are, of course, what is driving us throughout this inquiry. So why did we invite Alex in the first place? Because we thought Alex is and you heard it, a very sound, well-researched, well-argued proponent of a system that suggests that we can heal the current paradigm. Many of the speakers that we will have in this series will say, no, capitalism doesn't work. We need something else. Alex is actually suggesting that we can drive sufficient change inside the current system to make it work for everybody. And that is, of course, very compelling because, as he says in the introduction of the book, we don't need to blindly jump into something new, which we've never tried or experimented. And all these theories that we have, they sound very good, but we don't necessarily know if they work. So if we can make the existing process work, that's best for all of us. So we will now go a little bit into a conversation as to, do we believe that message? And we will ask you at the end to vote on whether you would actually go for Alex's proposal. So let's start the transformation laboratory, and we will build here on the concepts that we shared with you in the last section. And if the slides are not entirely clear to you, we ask you to have a look at the website where we have a short video that explains them. So again, the way we're thinking about a typical capitalist economy is this. You have financial flows and you have production and consumption flows between the different constituents that are making up the economy, right? So the economy embedded in the government. So what we also pointed out in the last section is that the reason we are investigating new alternative models is because we are facing a number of crises that are popping up directly or indirectly in all the aspects of this system. We see economic inequality because of the wealth concentration that comes almost necessarily out of a market economy. We're seeing a decline in public goods, and the attempts to nationalize some of the distribution of public goods over the last decades have not necessarily worked out. We see ruthless globalization, which leads to much suffering in many parts of the world. And over time, we're also experiencing an erosion of democracy, where kind of populists are popping up who are taking an ever more aggressive position against the elites and those people in the center that are somehow starting to dominate our world and our economies. So very interesting what is happening, and also very dangerous to a degree. And I want to just remind you, and if you haven't seen it, please have a look at the last edition. Christian Felber, who has written the book about the economy for the common good, boy, he had a big bag of potential interventions to offer to tackle these crises, right? So from interventions in the financial circuits, in the real economy, in regulation, he had it all. And it's a very interesting book because it has so many detailed measures that are being applied. What is it that Alex has to offer? I mean, you heard it a little in the conversation that we just had, but there's actually not very much, right? Again, if you compare this and this, he's basically suggesting that by a reorientation of the economy towards social value, which based on Paul's interesting question on the chat, is actually defined as profit plus externalities in a certain way. Reorienting the economy towards social value, we will move towards an acceptable relationship between purpose and profit if that is embedded in the way that financial organizations start to steward companies, and if companies themselves become more purpose-oriented, as Antoinette pointed out. On top of that, you've heard him just say that there needs to be a degree of redistribution by the state for social welfare. And these are the main interventions that actually this book is boiling down to if you're reading between the lines. Now, what is the value system that this comes closest to? And this is the section I will briefly pick up, and then I will hand over to Antoinette for institutions and case for the change theory. So let's make sense of Grow the Pie and Pieconomics in the context of the ideological landscape. So you can see the different contemporary political ideologies on the slide. And we will argue that it mostly fits towards classical liberalism, neoliberalism, libertarianism, which is the yellow paradigm on the bottom left. And we have prepared one slide to take that a little bit into a more concrete language. When we go and talk about sustainability and corporate social responsibility, CSR in general terms, we find a number of variances. And Antoinette and I try to allocate these variances in the ideological landscape. So in the neoliberal or classical liberal domain, you very often find enlightened shareholder value, ESV, which is standing out because it basically is arguing for a shareholder primacy and the focus on profits, where considerations about sustainability that relate to long-term viability of the business are mostly treated as risk mitigation. So enlightened shareholder value basically means let's do anything that helps us to maintain the profitability of the company in the long run. And then if that implies we shouldn't risk our reputation with the scandals, or if we should do the minimum necessary to stay out of jail, that's what we need to do. And we will also monitor and disclose that voluntarily. We're moving towards this stakeholder capitalism in the middle, which we suggest is leaning towards a more modern liberal Republican theme. Here we're already starting to see that other stakeholders get more rights. So they have a say in the way that corporate governance decisions are being taken. They might have more protection against the influence from shareholders. Right, so you might see limitations in terms of voting rights for certain investors that are coming in and could otherwise dominate the way an organization is being driven. And there's a lot of focus on more mandatory disclosure and ensuring that every stakeholder gets the basic freedom, liberty, contribution, participation they deserve. And then we would suggest there's another paradigm which very often is being talked about, which is called corporate shared value, which leans towards a communitarian frame. So here what you will find is a slightly different language, where in the orange you have a duty of care, in the green you start to really care, so to speak. And it's much more driven by a community that is coming together for a shared purpose. And the purpose is really what is overriding most of the decisions that are being made or the way that people interact. It's a mutualistic paradigm. And that also very often means that the company is branching out to include a much wider ecosystem of agents at a local level or at a global level, where together they look for opportunities to generate value. And it's very active. So you can see in the role of the environment role there, from voluntary, we move to mandatory disclosure. And here we're actually trying to actively renew the environment within which we operate. And the question here, of course, is Pieconomics, where does it sit? And you can see in the summary on the right, it uses words that go a little bit across the table, which makes it really hard to find its natural home. But we will argue that because the focus is very close to enlightened shareholder value, it stays on the profits. The interaction with other shareholders is not really, as Antoinette tried to probe a little bit, is not really embedded in institutions in terms of rights as in orange. And it's also not really coming through in a larger and wider engagement that we would see in CSV. It actually is mostly in the yellow space. And Antoinette, in case you want to add a word to this or then hand over to institutions, I think that's very much what we concluded in terms of the paradigm.
Maybe let me take up one thing. What I believe, if you go to the orange frame, which makes it rather distinct, is that we say you would have also strong formal stakeholder rights. So you would really have formal voice. You might have stakeholders on the board. And I think not a lot on stakeholder capitalism even moves there. So you also have to see this is stylized. These are archetypes. It's not probably what's out there. So we looked at the WEF stakeholder capitalism, and as you can imagine, it's more in the yellow than in the orange. But I mean, just to give you a little bit of an idea how you could try to make it clean and then really have distinctions against which you could see where these are. Okay, so let's go to the institutions, and those who were here last time know that already. So we are looking which institutions are going to be changed in this in the framework of Alex. And by looking at it, we were thinking, well, it's a lot about making markets functioning better. So market liberalization is certainly a topic. We also find some aspects of mixed economy, and I'm going to be more concrete just on the next slide. And there will be, particularly when it comes to the mindset shift, a need to go towards this civic empowerment, because that's all about us really changing our view on how business should function and how should business look like in the future. So maybe it's easier to see it on this slide. So maybe I have to repeat one of his sentences in the book, and I think he repeated it also in the talk, where he said, first and foremost, responsible investment is in the end simply good investing. And I think that's quite telling, that you probably don't have to go very crazy in changing the institutions in his view. After you have a mindset change, everything else follows more or less naturally. But you also heard that he could be quiet. He might have a different opinion towards that than what we have defined here. Now, if we look at what kind of regulations he is saying, or what he says about regulations, then you see that very nicely in this mixed economy. So he's really saying, make it cause related, go at the root cause. And that's, for instance, why he says, do not unduly limit share buybacks, or don't make CEO compensation at least a pay dispersion. That shouldn't be a topic according to my evidence. So he is quite clear here. But you also see, and that was he was taking that up, that he has some ideas for regulation. For instance, he says, you should try to subsidy or taxation to help to redistribute the gains and losses from a pie growing activity. So he here is rather clear. And also, if you go to the market liberalization, because he said that also very clearly, he says, well, sometimes you have to prohibit certain practices. I mean, if there are too many externalities and these outweigh any benefit, then we just have to prohibit it. And he also says externalities have to be assigned clearly. So you, for instance, have to make them tradable rights in order that we can work with it. And that's all in the more regulatory part. But as I said, most importantly is this mindset shift. And the mindset shift, the biggest mindset shift he is really asking for is in the finance industry. So he wants to see the investors doing stewardship, really nailing down on that purpose that companies should have embedded. And then maybe somewhat secondary, but also featured in the book, employees as actively engaged, customers, maybe even going towards activism and education. As you heard him very clearly, evidence-based mindset, but also financial literacy. So that, I believe, are the most important changes. I mean, I don't know, OTKs, any further points here?
No, I think I would just support the point that there's not much. I mean, in reality, what is on the left-hand side is what we mostly already have, or there's no need to intervene. In the middle, there's a little bit of challenge on what is in course, what people might do wrongly. So it's more like, don't go over the top in trying to redistribute or in try to regulate.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, it's very much based upon the status quo of the current institutions rather than changing the status quo or adding institutions to the game.
Which leads us nicely to the change and transformation section. Case, do you want to take this?
Yes. So whereas we were kind of struggling with Christian Felber, where does Christian fit with his philosophy? I think in the case of Alex, it's crystal clear. Eh? So if we can choose in the continuum between yellow on the left and red on the right, and then the merge in between. In my opinion, Alex and Pieconomics is very much in the yellow, whereas his narrative is based upon the current market. It is I don't think it's about reinventing capitalism. I think it's about reinterpreting capitalism. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But what I do find important is that his philosophy is geared towards fixing the system, not so much changing the system. So I think it's very much driven by incremental change within the system. So very much in the yellow. And from a motivation perspective, as both you, Otti, as Antoinette already highlighted, the Alex approach demands a mind shift change, which is an emergent thing. So it's very much based upon the idea that people will be intrinsically motivated to do purposeful things. Whether that will create financial value as well as societal value, whether that is from the perspective of an employee or the CEO or investors, it doesn't really matter. It's an intrinsic motivation to add value and therefore also create value. And then if we go over to the opportunity in the change strategy. Alex, of course, has a very clear set of key actors, which is, well, basically the cliche business community, where a collection of the investors, the employees, the customer, the CEO as a driving force, and the emergent energy in between those players and actors. Last but not least, if we would go to the capability bit, the strategy on collective action, in my opinion, that is completely lacking in his book. He's not really going into depth of the dynamics in the group of change makers well, he basically isn't. He doesn't deal with the emergent energy of the change. But if we can go on to the next slide, and so although I'm really enthusiastic about the seriousness and the robustness of the research from a individual company perspective. There are some potential failures within the narrative that we have to acknowledge. And the first of all is that in Alex's view, there is a quite sturdy dependence on the well-meantness of the financial industry. And although I'm not here to diss people that work in banking or have worked in banking, Otti, not my intention at all. But we do find some research that is actually questioning the intrinsic motivation or the intrinsic goodness in banking employees. So if we go to the research on the left side, the business culture and dishonesty in the banking industry, the conclusion of the research is that the prevailing business culture in finance industry weakens and undermines the honesty norm, which is quite a serious conclusion. And if we then go on the right for the research that was presented in the economic journal, we see that finance pros are less risk averse, less trustworthy, show higher levels of psychopathy, and are more competitive than general populations, which I think is troublesome if you see the emphasis that Alex is putting on these groups to perform above their self-interest. So, and a second point of critique is that in Alex's approach and theory, there is a huge role also to play for the customer. So if a company does purposeful stuff, creates value in the broader sense of the word, so not only financial capital or financial value, but also public value, the idea is that customers will be interested and consume their products more willingly. And although that makes sense, there is in multiple countries, and I can talk in the Netherlands, that after a couple of years of an increase of willingness to consume purposeful products, we now see that a lot of purposeful products that have an inherent social or environmental value, doing good, are basically struggling. And a lot of it has to do that those products in many cases are more expensive than market average, and that is a big problem. And then we have a third problem, a third element that is happening, and that is that there is, especially the last 1.5 years, there is some serious anti-ESG pushback happening. The epicenter of this, of course, I would say, is the US, where we see that, especially in Republican states, the ESG development in finance is taking a serious backlash and serious resistance, and taking into account that also in the Netherlands and in Europe in general, we anticipate a potentially quite dramatic growth of populist right-wing political developments. This might also cross the ocean and become a serious factor in Europe as well. And then if we look at the headlines, where we see companies like Unilever taking a step back on their proposed sustainability efforts, I think this is a potentially really important development taking place. So all in all, I think there is a lot of potential in Pieconomics, in growing the pie, but very much within the current system. I don't think Pieconomics is about changing the system. Back to you, Audrey.
Very, very nice. And I think maybe, Antoinette, do you want to say something about the chart on the right to finish off this section?
Yeah, because we finally had, I think the first question on the chat was going towards that direction. So if you wondered whether CSR is really having impact on social important aspects, then I just find it very telling that this is a very new analysis by some researchers who show, yes, we have this in many studies, correlation, and as Alex has shown, even causality between CSR initiatives and financial performance. But there were only 5 studies, and I mean, that is really very poor, who looked at social impact. And those 5 studies which really looked at social impact, so in other words, is it producing something valuable for the planet, the people, and so on and so forth? 2 were showing very little effect, 1 was showing a negative effect, and 2 were showing no effect. So I guess before we don't know that, it's a little bit difficult to say that this is going to save the world.
Yeah, no, this is because as the financial sector is so important in Alex's approach, it might also be important to note that last March, a couple of quite substantial banks, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, left the Equator principles, which are quite, from a financial perspective, fundamental to sustainability and environmental and corporate or social governance. So this is actual modern information that is quite important, that I think is not going into the proper direction to make Pieconomics work in the long run. They are making a movement back to, let's say, business as usual.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the general theme, right? So if people do things, as people on the chat said, with the right intentions, in the right way, undoubtedly will have benefits. But I think what Kees is pointing out is there might not be so many people who actually do things for the right reasons in the right way. And the system is actually not necessarily helping those people because the prices go up for those products. The products are being priced out of the markets. There's pressure for people to not do the right thing or ignore the shareholder primacy that we talked about in the yellow paradigm. So again, I think one thing that stands out in our model where we always look at the values, the socio-technical structures and the people and the relationships and the power within an organizational system or within a societal system, you probably need to pull many different levers to ultimately yield a different pattern of behavior. So the notion that you can just do that with a mindset change is problematic, which brings me to the vote. What Antoinette, Kees, and I wanted to share, and Silvio, is the discussion is starting to get interesting. Why? Because we suddenly have multiple proposals and we're trying to deploy a standard framework for the analysis. So today, everybody who is here will have a choice between two paradigms, the ones that we looked at last time, economy for the common good. And you can find the summary that reflects the summary that is for you on the website, and Pieconomics. And the summary reflects, again, what we talked about in the 3 sections today. So the question for you is, do you believe Pieconomics will be better in creating the changes that you feel are necessary to reinvent capitalism? Or is it the ECG? And you should take into account the capacity of both frameworks to be implemented as well, because if you remember with the ECG, we had lots of concerns that nobody would vote for it because it went towards a more socialist and red direction. So if you had to choose tomorrow between endorsing the one or the other, where's your heart today? And I think we just make this a chat exercise. So for everybody who has a point of view, do you go, and you have no other choice? Matthias, I've seen your point on Blue Ocean strategy and so on, but let's assume these are the two only choices you have. Which one do you go for? So is it Pieconomics? Luz is saying Pieconomics. Common good all the way, Sebastian.
So you want us to
Okay,
type
it's
one or the other in the chat?
Pieconomics. Paul, it's 2-1.
I'm not sure
Let's see
that
if
Paul saw the other, though. Common good.
Yeah, Paul, I think you get a homework to watch
Yeah.
Christian Felber
Yeah.
by Antoinette, but that aside, 2-1, more pie, more extraction, exploitation, and that means Tim goes with ECG. Val, the problem, solidarity, Pieconomics for the little I've seen, Pieconomics, common good. So I think what we're moving towards is almost a 50-50. There's a split in opinions, which of course will make for, Matthias says not enough knowledge yet.
Yeah,
So again,
Matthias, that's
everybody
fair.
please look at the books or the websites. It's interesting, right? It's not an easy choice. And yet, I think that's the whole point of this series. We as adults, we need to commit to something if we want to have any agency in this game, right? If we want to be part of a positive shift in the markets, we need to understand this. We need to be able to analyze the different proposals, and we ultimately need to commit to one. And that's the purpose of this series. And now, before we go into the discussion, I will formally close the call with a quick reminder of what is going to happen next. So please don't drop off, because we're going to have the open chat in a second. But Kees, do you just want to quickly remind people what is going to follow from this call?
Yes. Everything that happened today is recorded, and we will put that online, so you can find any information on the website, and you can also find lots of other materials, books, TED Talks, anything that can help you to get to grip with all these new thinkers and their philosophies. And we will have a new session quite soon on June 19, upcoming June 19, and we will then meet at 1600 Central European Time again. And I'm really happy to present that we will invite and have Helena Norberg-Hodge in our midst, which is one of the thinkers that is very close to my heart. Helena has a wonderful story, and with Local Future, she created a wonderful hub for initiatives all over the planet. And to make a long story short, what you can anticipate is that Helena says that, you know, the problem with our current economic system is that because it is so global, it is dehumanized and abstract. So her philosophy is very much geared toward, if we can relocalize economics, if we can make economics again about people that know each other, all the way back to Adam Smith with the baker and the butcher, then economics will fundamentally change.
If you're not excited now to watch that next episode and be part of it, I don't know. And I really hope that some of the excitement that we certainly have from going through all these episodes is also getting over to you. Please invite anyone who you feel needs to be part of this. And with that, I will formally close the formal part of the session, invite you to stay on for the Q&A or for the open plenary. And please help us to reinvent capitalism and make the world of business as we know it a little bit better day by day by day by day. And with that, have a good rest of the week. Take good care and speak to you all soon.